Hi, and thank you for joining us for this episode of The State of Leadership, Simple and Beyond. That is Robert Hilliard. I am Whitney Wiley, and we are here on Thursdays, 3 p.m. Eastern, 12 noon Pacific, talking all things leadership. And today we are talking about leadership presence, what it is, when it matters to you, and why it's essential that you have it. And Robert, in particular, of the two of us, is branded as an executive coach. I work with executive, but he actually is branded and trained as an executive coach. And so I'm sure he has lots to say about executive presence and the challenges that you help your clients through. So, again, we're going to talk about the what, the when, and the why. And then we're going to invite you at the end if you want to develop the how, work through that. We're going to have some collateral, a piece that I've been working on for us that will help with that. And then we'll give you some information on how you can reach out to us if you would like to work on developing your leadership presence after the program is over. If you are watching this on YouTube, I don't always remember to say this, but if you're watching this on YouTube in particular, don't forget to like and subscribe so that you can be notified when we go live in the future. And so, Robert, some opening thoughts on leadership presence.
Well, I think it's interesting because you've mentioned executive presence and leadership presence, and that's kind of
Mhm.
how I do it. I kind of combine the two, right? I don't separate them
Did
because
I say leadership?
you did, and
Oh,
that's okay because
yeah,
right,
okay.
because anybody can be a leader, but not everybody is an executive. So
That
there's a
part is
subtle difference between the two of them. And a lot of people consider executive presence more or less an offshoot of leadership presence. So just my opening thoughts there, just so we can get that out of the way, because you never know. There may be somebody in the audience going, those aren't exactly the same things.
they aren't exactly the same thing. So, interestingly, see, so you uh, help me to be in touch with what I'm saying because I didn't realize that I had interchanged the two. And I'm going to say, I didn't really stop to think that they're not exactly the same. And so that's helpful for me. And I get it. Everyone that is a leader or is leading, whether they have title or not, obviously is not an executive. And hopefully, everyone who is an executive is really good at leading.
And that's why I really don't separate them too much, because if you're an executive, you're going to be seen as a leader. So I really don't make it separate them too much.
And I would like to think that the other piece is that what is beneficial in terms of what we're going to be talking about today. And we may come at this from different perspectives,
Yeah,
right? What we're going to be talking about today
sure.
will benefit everyone.
Hmm.
Particularly, I'm going to talk a few things about moving towards promotion and how you are being seen, and how people are seeing you and how that impacts your ability to
Right.
be promoted, right? Because it's not always what you're doing, it's how you're doing it. And that's at least the perspective that I'm going to come from this at. And I'm looking forward to hearing your perspective because we have not had this conversation. I think in all the time that we've known each other, out of all the things that we've talked about, that I feel like I know where you're coming from because we've had either conversations about it or conversations around it. This would not be one of them. So it's going to be interesting. So I'm going to frame it this way. It's your executive presence It's not just about how you look or sound, and I think sometimes people think it's about because we're talking presence, and people are thinking that visual, or how you look physically. And while it includes that, it's really about how you show up and how people experience you, from where I'm coming from. And I think that's helpful because it then ties into our leadership framework of simple,
Mhm.
right? And paying attention to how you are showing up, how you are impacting other people, whether or not your presence as an executive or a leader is in alignment with how you want to be seen, right? And sometimes we don't stop and think about
Right.
how other people are perceiving us. We're always, this is what I'm intending, but there has to be a time where you start to connect the dots so you can ask the question, this is how I want to be perceived. Is that in reality the way I'm showing up and people are experiencing me? Right. And so there are a couple of things that have come to mind for me in terms of, I'll say three components, right? Sort of gravitas, your confidence, whether or not you are a poised person, and certainly when it comes to leadership, and it, certainly executives who are leaders, and we've talked about this to some extent, your ability to be decisive, right? It matters to other people that, and there's a balancing act here, that you are decisive, but people don't think that you are rash, unfair, and without giving some thought to what you're making decisions about. So there's that, that sort of the gravitas piece, your communication. Are you able to communicate with clarity and have the ability to impact people? And I think about the executives I have worked for and with, and uh, there's impact. Is it always the impact that they want? Is it the impact that they're intending? Right? Sometimes there's a negative impact, sometimes there's a more positive impact. And you want to stop and think about, am I communicating what I want to communicate in a way, in a tone, and impactfully that gets to the results that I want? And then there is the appearance piece, right? Not just physically, but is your physicality in alignment with the message that you're sending? Is it appropriate for the context that you find yourself in? And paying attention to those various components, I think, sets a foundation for how we show up in our executive presence. And I think the final piece I want to say, sort of in this opening, is that the good news is that executive presence, like leadership to a large degree, it's a skill, right? It's not limited to those that are born with it, right? It's not a personality trait, and it's something that you can develop. You just have to decide that that's what you want to do.
Absolutely. You know, when I think about executive presence, or leadership presence, because like I said, I don't make a real hard distinction between the two of them, because the things that are going to help you, as an executive are also going to help you as a leader, and vice versa. So, but when I think about them, I like to, and you know how I usually work, even though I think systemically, I like to put things kind of in a linear kind of list and then see how they relate to each other, because everything is connected, some
Hmm.
things more strongly than others. But there at least is a cascading effect. So what you said, gravitas, or confidence, which is a major part of gravitas. It's really about having a strong sense of self-assuredness without being arrogant. And that's the key, because some people, they equate being self-assured with arrogance, and
Hmm.
they are not the same thing. So
I want to, before you go on, don't want to distract you too much, take you down a wrong path. Unless you're a woman, in which case you have to be careful, because self assuredness in women sometimes comes across to people not just arrogant, but aggressive. And that's not the intent. And so, a trait in a man that a woman has will often be seen, it can often be seen in a negative light. So, I just wanted to pop that in real quick.
Absolutely. And right before I started speaking, I was debating as to whether or not I should bring that up and how I would present that. So I'm glad you did, because I was like, there's a difference there, because we talked about this a little bit last week. And me, I don't get on soapboxes much, but men do something one way, and women, if they do the same thing, are perceived differently in many, many cases. So I'm glad you made that distinction. And then we talk about communication. And that's really about being clear, concise. And we talked about mastery last time, but it's really about
Hmm.
mastering your speaking and listening skills, so that not only when you're speaking, you're getting your message across, but other people, if they have objections or they have questions about what you're talking about, feel listened to. And we've all been in meetings with executives where they have a message, and sometimes those messages are negative. They have to convey those to us, and we may have questions. And in answering the question, when the question is over, you don't you don't feel like they heard you at all. So that's really a big part of executive presence. It's really, we talked about mastering your message, but also mastering your listening skills,
Hmm.
so that people leave those meetings, particularly in those high stakes environments when you have to relay something maybe negative, they feel like their questions were answered. They may not be happy about it, but at least they know what's going on.
What I love about this, and definitely what you just said, and it reminds me that all of these pieces that we talk about on the show are interconnected and interrelated, and it, it, nothing works in a vacuum, right? And nothing works in a vacuum. And so when you're talking about communication, it's not just the message that you send out. Communication is a two-way street. That means listening to people, making sure they feel heard. When they feel heard, right, it sends a message that you care. And we often talk about, as in your role as a leader, how you make your team members feel, so that they are in engaged, more inclined to want to be engaged, because they understand what they're there for, right? Why they're there, how they're contributing, and that comes back to the communication piece. And I think, in a lot of respects, it also goes touches into that gravitas, because if you make it seem like it's all about you, and you're the only one with all the answers, and that other people don't fit in and don't play a part, it's harder for them to want to be connected, and it's easier to disengage, because I don't feel like I have a part to play in this.
And let's dig a little deeper in that relationship between gravitas, or confidence, and communication. So while you're communicating with other people or your team members, your subordinates, however you want to call them, if you're not confident in how you do it, the message will not get received probably the way you want it to. So there's a connection there. And so you have to move into these. There's a cascading effect with
Mhm.
almost every single, I will say, with every single one of these elements that I'm gonna bring up. But there's a connection there. There's a connection between communication and gravitas or confidence, however you want to call it. Since there are, more C's on my list than G's, I'll say it's confidence, but they're not exactly the same thing. But confidence is a part of gravitas. But you have to really know that these things are all connected.
Absolutely. So go deeper. You got a list?
I always have a list. So
Okay.
I may not always talk about it, but I always have a list. So emotional intelligence, that's another part of it. And that's another part of leadership presence as well. And we all know that there are 4 parts to emotional intelligence, right? So there's self-awareness, knowing what's going on inside of you.
Hmm.
There's self-regulation, being able to monitor your emotions and regulate them, right? Keeping uh, your uh, your emotions on an even keel, right? So you're not going off on tangents and blowing up when you really shouldn't be. Then there's social awareness, being able to read the room. And we all have been with executives that did not know how to read the room. And that goes into communication as well. And then the last one is relationship building.
Hmm.
Building those strong relationships, showing empathy so that people get a sense that you are able to put yourself in their shoes and know where they're coming from.
I love that, right? Now, when I think of emotional intelligence in particular, managing your emotions, that you're understanding the self-awareness piece, the social awareness piece, managing yourself, managing others. Are you able to remain calm and grounded in high stress situations? Because I think of those people that I have worked for, the ones that cannot or do not, certainly more often than not, right? When they do not, cannot, we think less of them. I certainly have thought less of them, right? The respect goes to those people who, when they find themselves sort of in that meat grinder, they acknowledge that the situation is the situation, but right, they can remain calm and collected, calm, cool, collected, grounded, and still be able to process so that they can make decisions that make sense and then be able to communicate those in a way that gives people a sense that they too can be calm and grounded in what's happening around.
Yeah, and this has a these of course these things connect to other things. You made a comment before about being decisive. And I agree with 95% of what you said. Here's the 5%. I think that leaders, and this is my personal opinion, this is the mental model I'm basing this off of, should be very decisive when there are simple things, but when there are complex things, they need to back up a little bit so they can consider everything that's going on. Because we have seen leaders that make really rash decisions,
Mhm.
and we talked about this when we way back when we had our show on complexity. I always know I'm in trouble when I bring somebody a complex problem, we call them wicked problems, and they go, "Oh, the answer is simple." He's like, "I know we're going to do something and we're going to have a really bad unintended consequence." But it's really hard to tell that to a leader, right? And the second part of, or an executive, the second part of that is if things do go bad because they made a rash decision, they made a decisive decision, and it goes off the rails, what will really help your credibility as an executive is if you are transparent and you take responsibility for the decision that was made.
So I'm going to correct your 95% and say actually you're 100% in alignment with you're actually 100% in
Okay,
alignment
good,
with what
good,
I said.
good.
And so it absolutely right.
Yeah,
It needs to be thoughtful and measured. And yes, when it can be made like that, you should not spend 6 weeks thinking about something that's simple to actually solve. And when something needs some um, some contemplation, it needs you to think it through and reasoned and measured that you are not off to the right. I think the problem comes when too much time is given to something that should be decided quickly, and not enough time is given to something that is complex and needs a little more thought to it. And so it's sort of backwards. And so in the end, it comes down to you need to give the appropriate amount of time and energy to the level of the challenge that comes along with the decision that needs to be made.
Look,
And to your point, if you make the wrong and I'm wrong in quotes, if you make the wrong decision, right, unless you are a heart surgeon or an engineer and built a bridge and it fell, or it's something catastrophic like that, most of the things that you decide are not fatal, right? The vast majority of the decisions that we make are not fatal. And therefore,
yeah,
own it. Own it.
absolutely. Absolutely. I just have to check something really quickly. Okay. So, because I have stuff going on, I just make sure no one's falling off a rooftop or something. So, but I wanted to bring something up, and I want to ask you. It's kind of a personal question, but it's we're deviating a little bit. But I want to make this personal because we're talking about executive presence, but we're also talking about leadership presence. But have you ever worked with somebody? It could be in your personal life where it just took them forever to make the simplest decision, and then sometimes they come and they ask you for your opinion, and you give them what you consider an educated, right, opinion, and then they come back with it confused them even more. That's happened to you?
Yes, I lived under that executive with that style for far too long. I would hazard to guess that some decisions that needed to have been made, I've been gone for a long time, probably still have not been made. And I think some of that is just, and here's the thing, I don't know if we've done an episode specifically on work styles,
I don't think so.
communication style. I know we've talked about communication and whatnot, but I don't think we've talked about styles. This person's work style was very linear, and therefore things, this person could only do the one thing at a time. And now I'm not a believer in multitasking, so I'm not talking about that aspect, but an ability to sort of pivot and to prioritize things that need to be made and move something to the background so that something more important and it has higher priority and more importance gets addressed right now. And so that style was, I haven't gotten to that yet, regardless of how important it is. Therefore, under that person, the lesson that I learned was that I was going to make the decisions and own whatever the consequences were that went along with maybe going out of, and that works for some people, may not work for everyone, or it depends on the nature of the work that you're in, right? But I was in such a position in that organization that it it wasn't actually detrimental to me, the job that I did or anything like that. But yes, and working under someone with that work style is very challenging, particularly if you don't have the authority, right, to do a workaround, because you have to wait until that person gives you the go ahead. So, um, yeah.
So let me ask you this: what was your opinion of that person? I don't want, not person, but of that person as an executive. How did you think they
I,
exhibited or didn't exhibit
I,
executive presence?
my opinion would be that there was a disconnect, or it was lacking.
Yeah,
It needed work. It needed how about I put it more positively? That executive presence needed some developing and improving. How's that?
right, right. And that goes to that whole gravitas piece, and you link that to being decisive. Because when someone is wishy-washy like that, because executive presence is really how you appear to other people.
Yes.
When someone is wishy-washy like that, it does not really help them exude a positive executive presence. And so I just wanted to just throw that out there because I
No.
too have worked with somebody like that. Um, but they were a little bit different, and I think how it manifested with this person was a lack of confidence. They dressed the
Mm,
part. They certainly had that polished appearance, but and I don't want to say that's all they had, but when it came down to certain things, they were not very. They didn't have composure, which is where we're going next. So composure is the next component, and it's really remaining calm and collected when the pressure is, when the heat is turned up or when the pressure is on. And
mhm.
it's really about being resilient. And resilience is the ability to bounce back after something has happened. That they're not dwelling on that thing and they didn't fall apart and they're still talking about something that happened, a day or two or a week ago or a month ago. They can't get over it. Executive presence, when you have good executive presence or you're seen as having executive presence, you're able to bounce back from those things and you can stay composed under pressure. I think one of the issues that a lot of executives are going to have is that there are some models out there of leaders and executives that people will start emulating that really don't have a lot of emotional intelligence and don't have a lot of composure. Um, and for a lot of people, I think what ends up happening is when we see a leader that doesn't have a lot of composure, or someone that gets hot under the collar, as they used to say, those folks tend to be forgiven when they are geniuses, right? So Steve Jobs, right?
Right.
Right? When you're a genius, people tend to, okay, well, that person's a genius. But most of us are at that level. So we shouldn't be emulating people like that if we can't back it up with the intellectual firepower that those folks have. So you want to be really careful of that because a lot of people do those things.
I'll just say I agree with you.
Yes, because that is when we see it, because a lot of times we want to emulate people who are in those positions, and it makes a lot of sense. If that person is in that position, if I can emulate that person, perhaps I can get some of what they have. And but
Right.
we don't, what we're seeing is just one side of it. You don't know the whole story there. And so you may not have the connections that they have. You may not have the intellectual firepower that they have. You may not have uh, um, just the education that they've had. So there's a lot of different things that go into that. So you want to be mindful. Yeah, it's okay to copy, or to use, I don't want to say copy, to
Model.
model yourself. That's a better word after somebody, but you don't want to just be copying them
Yeah.
without looking at, maybe you want to look at, I want to model myself on this aspect of what they do, or maybe it's this aspect of what they do. But you want to be very careful of just copying somebody.
I just want to say, sort of in this vein of modeling people, to look at a broad swath of examples, right? So that you actually have some things to compare and contrast. And to your point of not having all the information, to actually get curious if it's possible to, particularly if it's someone that you work for with closely, can get to know, ask some questions about whether or not what they're doing, the way they do it, if it's working for them to get what they want. Because in addition to not knowing all the variables, what they're trying to achieve may not be what you're trying to achieve. And therefore, something that's working for someone or appears to be working for someone may not work for you because not only are the variables around them different, but the variables around you are different.
Absolutely. And we've all been around those folks that copy other people. And something else that you said really makes sense. You got to, if you want to be seen with authenticity, you have to be genuine in how you do those things. And just copying somebody is not a genuine thing. It really comes off as being phony, and that will tank anything else because people generally don't like phonies. So something
And
one of
that goes back to the self-awareness piece,
yep,
right? Which is taking stock of what's working for someone or what you're thinking of modeling and running it through a filter, right? Which would be more of a how or strategy. And we'll talk about how you can go about doing that later. But um, you want to make sure that something that you're considering doing makes sense for you, your personality, the team, or the people that you're going to be working with, right? And something that works in one situation may not work in another. And as your team evolves, even something that you're doing right now, right? That where you show up in a way that resonates with your people as your team shifts, either because they grow or you've got new parts, new components, different people on your team. It's not, the team that you have today should not be the team that you have a year from now, 2 years from now, 5 years from now, even if the personalities are the same, because they should be growing. You should be growing, and therefore, it's not the same, right? And Robert could talk about that from a systems perspective if he wanted to. We could talk about it on another program, but it's not the same, and therefore, you should be evolving your leadership presence, your executive presence, as you are moving through the things that you're moving through.
absolutely. And then I purposely, when I was listing these things out, put appearance last. And I did that on purpose because when we say executive presence, that's usually the first thing that people think
Yeah,
about.
right.
So having that polished professional demeanor, it's not just about how you're dressing, and that's why demeanor is really important. It's about how you show up. It's really about having that positive, confident body language, and there's the connection to communication. So really, it's important because that's the first thing that people see. But I think that if we want to give all of these things weight, it has some weight to it, but is not as weighty as some of the other things. I like to
Right.
think of it like a really, there's many analogies we can make, but think about executive presence like a really good book or a really beautifully baked piece of pastry, right? The outside could look phenomenal. A book can have a fantastic cover, and then you open it up and it's just not a good book. You want to have some substance, or that piece of pastry may look great on the outside and taste like soap when you take a bite. So you want to make sure that it's balanced out. So you have all these other things that balance it out. So you're not just working on having a great wardrobe and working on having really good posture and working on making sure that you have open body language and all of that other stuff so that you appear like a leader or an executive, but then there's no substance. You don't listen well, you don't communicate well, you really haven't thought out your message, you have awful emotional intelligence, and you have no composure. You fly off the handle. Those other things will lose you jobs.
Right. And there's a term for that,
Go ahead.
empty suit,
Empty suit. Absolutely.
right?
Absolutely.
And so it's someone who on the outside
Doing it.
has all the things. If you wanted to distill this down, I think, to a couple of words of what it is you're trying to achieve with these various components, commanding the room is sort of the essence of what it is you're looking for. And as you were talking, right, you could have all the best suit and the hair coiffed and the jewelry, or not jewelry if you're a guy, not jewelry if you're a guy. um I'll say it one more time, the not jewelry, and except maybe a wedding ring if you're a guy. um Again, it's about how people are perceiving you and your ability to command the room. You may get attention from being dressed well, but can you command the room? And I have an example. I may have shared this at some point. I had the habit of leading these like huge work groups, facilitating work groups and negotiating, language for when I was lobbying and in deals and contracts and other things as a lawyer. And I had the habit of not sitting at the what would typically be the head of the table, right? And I had someone come in once and ask me why I sat where I sat. And they were like, you're leading the meeting. Why are you not sitting at the table? I said, well, the head of the table is where I am,
Right.
right? And so I don't need to put on you don't need to put on the airs, right? The trappings of being in charge or having presence if you have it. And so that ability to command the room. But the reason that I sat mid table is because it made me closer to everyone. I could see everyone in a way that sent the message that I was there communicating with them. And it's not like you're like far off and I don't know who you are. So I'm in a place where I was very intentional about the message that I wanted to send. And it's like, yeah, I could sit at the head of the table. Doesn't make me a better leader to be there. What makes me a better leader, at least in my opinion, was that. Oh, and this was something, a skill that I learned over time in facilitating, was that people need to be heard. They needed to feel like they were heard. And my ability to distill complex concepts and break it down so that I could then disseminate it back out to make sure that when people spoke, I heard them and that other people heard them as well, right? And which allowed us to be able to negotiate to get to the successful outcomes
Mhm.
ultimately that we had. So that ability to command the room, regardless of, and I didn't say regardless of how you're dressed, because I don't want to suggest you should be able to show up grubby, but your example of Steve Jobs, very simple. Black pants, black shirt, I think black turtle,
Mhm.
mock turtle, right? Black slacks. His uniform, he wore that. I don't can't think of a time when I didn't see him in that. There may have been, but I can't think of a time when I didn't see him dressed like that. And notwithstanding all his flaws, and we all have flaws, he was someone who walked in and people took notice, paid attention, right? And that's what we're talking about. So yes, there is a physical appearance of component, but I think very appropriately placed last,
Yeah.
and so that it's not the focus. What are the other things that you're bringing in addition to how you're dressed, your
Mhm.
posture, whether or not you're making eye contact?
Mhm.
All right, eye contact helps to establish trust.
Mhm.
When you don't make eye contact, and with some cultural differences,
Yeah.
right? Making eye contact, at least in our culture, is a way to establish trust. There are other cultures you need to be careful about eye contact and what that means. But you want to make sure that your energy which is another component of the simple leadership framework, right? That your energy is aligned with the confidence, the gravitas that you're projecting, right? That's how you get the authenticity and the genuineness, is that all of these things are congruent, right? They're not in a vacuum. And so people can't say that you're an empty suit because you bring the substance along with the physical piece, the
Absolutely.
form and substance.
Yeah, absolutely. And the other thing I want to mention about appearance is it's got to be culturally aligned with your organization. And a lot of times we forget that just because you may go out and buy a Ferragamo suit for your job, uh, but you work in tech and they come in dressed like this. Right. So you can, if this is what's considered polished and professional in the business that you're in or the organization you're in, that is how you should show up. You need to balance it out. So you need to investigate what the culture is and understand how, and we talked about culture, I think we did, cultural artifacts, how people dress is a cultural artifact. So you want to be able to look at that stuff and make a decision based on that. You want to be in line with what other people are doing. You can have your own sense of flair when you
Yes.
do that. I used to, when I worked at my last job, we all had to come in suits. Mine were my ties. I had, very distinctive ties. They were always professional, but they were very colorful and had very interesting patterns on them. That was how I set myself apart. That was my thing. I no longer wear ties. I'm kind of happy about that, but I still have them in case I need to. If I'm going to interact with another organization, one of the first things I do is I go to the website and I start looking at how people are dressed. Uh, and
Mm-hmm.
from the CEO on down, and so I know how I should show up. And if I am iffy about it, whoever my contact is in human resources, I'll say, hey, what's the dress code there? How do people usually dress? So I can come in and right off the bat have some sort of alignment. It's not going to be perfect because I'm not part of that organization, but have some kind of alignment with their culture.
I love that little caveat. You want to still make sure you're comfortable, right? Because if
Absolutely.
you're not comfortable
No.
in whatever you're not going to show up as your best self. And
Right.
so you can be in alignment with the culture, and if you're uncomfortable in how, you're not going to project ultimately. So you've got to find that there's a balancing act there, as there
Absolutely.
is, and so much of what we talk about. All right, there's a balancing act. You need to feel comfortable. And it's interesting because I did a presentation on preparing for interviews. And one of the things that I suggested, speaking of Steve Jobs, is that part of what you're doing to prepare for the interview is obviously doing some homework, doing some research on the company that you're going to be interviewing with, which means understanding the culture, how do people dress so that you can dress appropriately for the interviews, and assuming that you really want the job that you're interviewing for, that create create your own uniform, right? It doesn't have to be as stark as Steve Jobs, black top, black pants, but create something, because one, this will help with decision fatigue, which becomes a part of creating stress for interviews. But what's your interview uniform? So that you have pieces that you're comfortable in, that you look good in, that match, right? What it is you're moving towards, right? Whether it's in an interview or delivering a presentation to the board or some other group of people in the organization. And we'll talk about this. When does this matter in just a second? This sort of ties in or leads into that. It, again, it's about being aligned and congruent, and recognizing that all of these pieces work together. None of what we're talking about is in a vacuum. And so you want to be comfortable, right? You want to be appropriate, and you've got to find your way to that. And it maybe it's a hit or miss. not hit or miss, that it's trial and error, right? Maybe it takes some time for you to find your stride in that, but be willing to do that so that you can find your tie, right? So that you can have, right, to be appropriate for the culture, but have your spin on it so that you feel comfortable, you feel like you, so you can be authentic, but it's not so outside the box that people are not paying attention to you because now you're just the weirdo in the group.
You're the sideshow, and it's so important what you said, because that really important interview or that really important presentation where you have to stand up in front of other executives or the senior leadership team is not the time to be trying out those brand new shoes that you bought. That's not the time to do that. Even if they may look amazing, that's not the time to try them out. Because if you're going to be walking on your pegs, they're going to be hurting. You're not going to have your best performance.
Absolutely. Which go ahead, let's lead into this when this matters, right? So things like when you're giving presentations, when you're in meetings, when you are working to resolve conflict, right, with peers or someone else, when you're in negotiation, that's the world that I came from, negotiations, interviews, right? Keeping in mind that first impressions are often lasting impressions, and you want to make sure that you're making the best first impression and continuing impression, quite frankly, that you can. So you're paying attention to the times when you are in moments that require you to influence other people, right? Are you influencing other people? Are you uh, in your role and looking to make transitions or get a promotion, right? So this means having some awareness of where you want your career to go, right? Where are you looking to move within the organization, or even if it's outside the organization a year or two from now, right? So that you have people within the organization who will speak on your behalf, who will be advocates or sponsors for you, even if you leave. But if they have an impression of you that's not in alignment with executiveness or being a leader or that whatever you aspire to, if that's not the impression that they have of you, what will happen is they may not know what it is, but they know you don't have it,
Mm-hmm,
or
mm-hmm.
they feel that you don't have it, and that may not be the case. So you want to pay attention early on. And I will say this is one of the mistakes that I made, and I will own this, was sort of, I'm not planning to be here for long. I'm just doing this thing here. And then you end up somewhere maybe longer than you planned. And the impression that you've left now doesn't align with the new goals or directions that you have. And people remember you as you were, right? And this is a way to think about this in your personal life if you've never experienced this in your professional life. Is when you see someone you haven't seen in a long time, family member, they remember you as you were. They don't know you as you are. And sometimes they have a difficult time accepting the change. And so the reason that this is so important, touching into the why at the same time, is because you never know where your career is going to take you or what you want to do down the line. And so sort of creating your brand and showing up in a particular way from the beginning becomes really important. And it's a lesson that I learned after the fact.
Yeah. You just made me think of so many things, and I almost got distracted because I was thinking about a personal situation where I was talking to somebody who was I don't want to say it was a conflict, but I've grown up with this person. I'm really good friends with this person. They've known me pretty much my entire life. But their picture in my mind when this problem came up was how I was when I was a teenager. And they wanted me to respond in that way. And I responded more measured, and they were like, "What happened to you?" I was like, I matured. I grew
I
up.
grew up.
I don't make rash decisions when it comes to things like that anymore because I learned those lessons. And so what you're saying is so true. And that happens, I remember with my last job, one of the best things that my then boss told me was that when I came in, he goes, "Look, I want to set you up for success." He goes, "So this first project you do here needs to be really good because the snapshot they take of you is going to be the snapshot that stays with you the rest of your career, which is why a lot of people don't advance here." And he goes, "I don't want you to suffer that." And so that was one of the best things he ever told me. And not only is it true for that organization, it's true for many organizations.
Yeah,
So, which is why when you enter that organization, if you are entering as an executive or with designs on being an executive, really should think about these components that we talked about. And like you said, I like to think of it as they're like a puzzle that completes a picture.
yes,
And
yes.
you want to have all of them. So I think we're going to talk about the how, I think, next before we wrap things up. But I just want to say one thing: look at this list that we gave you today and which ones you think you're good at, which ones that you're not so good at. Make a plan for both. Make a plan to lead with your strengths for the ones that you are good at and how you will get better at the ones that you're not so good at. And get some
I
feedback from people.
I love that sort of analogy of a puzzle, right? You could also look at it as it's a bridge between sort of where you are and where you want to go. And you want to constantly be, helping people see you not where you are, but where you're trying to go. And I will say that that was the lesson that I got. I was like, I was very fine with who I was and what I was doing. There wasn't a problem. The challenge came when I decided I wanted to be something else. And right now there's a disconnect
Yeah.
for other people. It wasn't a disconnect for me. And maybe we'll talk. I know we've done this on occasion, but we'll maybe dedicate a couple of episodes to our journeys and some of the lessons that have come. And my journey, very circuitous, right? Sort of, it's like, how did you get here from there? Kind of thing, and what I was studying and the whole thing. So
I love that idea.
for other people, it's a disconnect. Another Steve Jobism. As I look at my life, I see the dots connected,
Mhm.
right? For someone standing on the outside or from looking, if I were to put myself in my 16-year-old self and look forward, and it's like, what the heck are you doing? Right? But looking back, I can see the dots. So this final, right? Again, the why this matters is that you can be as smart and capable and high performing as you want to be, but if your presence doesn't reflect that, if people don't get that, particularly decision makers, people who are going to make the determinations about whether or not you you know get to be an executive or move up through the ranks as an executive, right? You will have done yourself a disservice. So it's important to keep your eyes on the prize, but to make sure that you are connecting for other people, right? By being someone who's trustworthy and credible, someone who is authentic and genuine, and the list that Robert brought up previously. So, if you want to get into the how, right? That's what we do. So we're going to give you now the opportunity to connect with us offline so that we can help you with the how. How do you develop your executive presence? How do you move through the challenges? What are the mistakes that you've made that maybe need to be corrected so that you can continue on the journey and the path that you want to move on? And so the answer to that is, Robert, if someone wants to connect with you so that they can start working on the how would they go about doing that?
They can reach me at inspireme@roberthilliardcoaching.com. That email will come directly to me, or just go to my website at Robert Hilliard Coaching and go to that contact sheet there, fill that out, send that to me. Tell me about some of the challenges that you're having with your executive presence, some of the goals that you have, where you want to be in your career, and we can set up a discovery call and talk about how we can work together.
Absolutely. And if you want to reach out to me, similarly, there's a form there for you to connect with me. And there are some resources on that site as well that are yours as a gift from me. So we want to thank you for joining us for this episode of the State of Leadership, Simple and Beyond. We are here again on Thursdays, 3 p.m. Eastern, 12 noon Pacific. We're always talking about leadership and executives as leaders, as is appropriate. If you would like to be on the program, talking about your journey, the lessons you've learned, how you help other leaders, please reach out to Robert or I. Or if you have a topic you would like for us to address, reach out and let us know. Again, if you're watching on YouTube, please like, subscribe, and share the program with others that you think would benefit. And again, whether you are watching us live or you watched on replay, drop a comment and let us know what are you going to work on, right? What is one of the aspects that we've discussed that is either a strength of yours or something that you know needs a little improvement? We would like to hear from you. So again, thank you for being here, and until next time, right? Be genuine, be authentic, and go ahead and command the room, and take care.
See you next time.